Welcome to another virtual Live Talks Los Angeles event featuring Jan Eliasberg in conversation with Tony Shalhoub, discussing her debut novel, Hannah's War. Jan is an award-winning screenwriter and director of film and television. She was handpicked by Michael Mann as the first woman to direct Miami Vice and Wiseguy. Her other credits include 13 Reasons Why, Bull, Nashville, Parenthood, TheMagicians, Blue Bloods, NCIS Los Angeles, Supernatural, and many others. Tony Shalhoub needs no introduction. He is a Tony, Golden Globe, and Emmy Award-winning actor. He's perhaps best known for his work as the obsessive-compulsive detective Adrian Monk in the hit television series Monk. Before we start, I thought I'd ask each of you to say something about how you met and how you know each other.
Jan and I, we go way back to the Yale Drama School. I think I was a second-year actor in the three-year program, and you came in, right? So you were one year class behind me. So we overlapped 2 years. We did have a chance to work together. I was very fortunate to be cast in Jan's second-year director's thesis project, right? It was a second-year project, yes. In which the second year was mostly focused on Shakespeare and the classics, and so Jan did a cutting of the Scottish play, and I was
the Scotsman.
I was the Scottish king, and I worked with the wonderful actress Izzy Monk, and Jan directed us in this. It was like a 50-minute cutting, wasn't it? As I remember.
Yeah, it was like almost an hour.
Okay. Yeah. And it was wonderful because Jan I remember at one point I was wearing a leather jacket, and a lot of it was shot outside in the old buildings, on the campus at Yale. And so it had that kind of old English feel to it, Scottish feel to it. And I think that was the time we worked together most. We might have overlapped in, classes and workshops and things like that.
Yeah. So I had been an enormous admirer of Tony's from the time that I started at Yale. And I will say that, we were there at such just a blossoming time for the drama school because, it was John Turturro, it was Tony, it was Izzy Monk, it was Angela Bassett. I mean, there were Fran McDormand. I mean, these were our classmates. And as a director, it was like a huge playground because I could do anything and work with anybody. And I felt like Tony was considered a little bit more of a comic actor, I think. And I just felt like that was definitely something he could do, but I saw something else. I saw a very deep, serious actor, and that's why I specifically chose him.
I think you saw the dark side.
I did. I saw the dark side. I tend to. If there's a dark side, I find it. We had a wonderful time working on that production because I did have this idea of taking it outside and making it almost like I believe the audience moved as we moved around. So we set it in different places as if the whole thing was a journey. And then, Tony graduated and went on to a kind of stellar career very quickly. And I was always following him and thinking, God, I would love to work with him again. And then we became friends more, I think, through Brooke, through Tony's wife, because they are Martha's Vineyard people and I'm a Martha's Vineyard person. So that was another overlap. And so we've just gotten closer. And when this book came out, Little Brown wanted to do a sort of pre-launch party. And I thought about who were the people that I felt had sort of influenced me in a deep way. And Tony was one of them. So I asked him if he would do the pre-launch party. And he did, but to my surprise, he also read the book, which I hadn't really expected. So I thought he'd show up and, you know, be glad handing and whatever. But no, because Tony's a really serious guy.
We overlapped in another way because what really I just gravitated to this book right away when I heard about it and what it was about, because I kind of you know, dipped my toe into this arena too. When I lived in New York in the 80s, when they still did network television and television movies, I was cast as Enrico Fermi in a movie called a TV movie called Day One, about the Manhattan Project. David Strathairn, the brilliant David Strathairn, played Oppenheimer, and the late, recently departed Brian Dennehy was General Groves, and there were many actors of all generations involved in this production. It was like a 3-hour CBS television film, really beautifully written, and I was lucky to be a part of it. That was when I really had not done a lot of television and film before that, and so I was kind of while we were doing that, the actors, as often happens, we did a kind of you know, crash course and research when we were doing our research, and they brought in physicists and nuclear physicists to kind of at least give us some idea of the universe we were in, and so we could in some ways sound like we knew what we were talking about. And it was fast. I found the whole story fascinating. It was not something that I had been too familiar with before that, and I just became hyper focused. So when I saw your book, and I you know, recognized so many of the locations and so many of the players, and because you do weave in real, you know, historical figures with fictional characters. So so that, you know, it was just I just thought it was just lovely, and you know, a place that I love to revisit.
Fermi actually he's an off-camera character in the book at this point, because there was a wonderful chapter that I ended up deleting. Sorry, Tony. but I had the chapter in which Enrico Fermi is in charge of the Chicago atomic pile, which was really the first sustained chain reaction. And I ended up deleting that. But now Fermi was the one who was taking bets when, right before they exploded the bomb in the Trinity test, Fermi bet that it would incinerate the state of New Mexico. They were all throwing money in the pot, and that was Fermi's guess that, you know, that would be the destruction level of the bomb. And he was not the most pessimistic either. Somebody said it would destroy the Earth's atmosphere. So,
that's how we sort of get tied together, Jan, you and I, and I guess we should just sort of launch into this thing, right? I mean, I'm really most interested because after Yale, as you said, you know, we sort of kind of went our separate ways, and we pursued our different careers. So I'm kind of curious as to, you know, how you transitioned, because I would always be hearing about your projects and then seeing, you know, you were directing theater, then you directed television. You directed many shows in the 80s that I auditioned for but never got. And
come on, I would have cast you in a heartbeat.
I've let go. I'm over it now. So, but I'm interested in how you transitioned from, you know, as being a director and such a stellar director into writing your own projects.
Well, that is a great question, and I can answer it. There's a very, very long answer and a shorter answer. So I'll give you kind of the shorter answer. You know, when I went to Yale, I had come from living in England for 2 years. That preceded my coming to Yale. And in England, I had been really privileged to apprentice in a number of different theaters and was actually offered a job at the Royal Court Theater. And I loved the English perspective on theater, which was taking these plays in the classic canon, whether they be Euripides or Aristophanes or Shakespeare or Ibsen or Brecht, all of whom I adored. And the director really had a point of view. So if you mounted a production of Measure for Measure, there would be 3 or 4 productions in London at the same time, but they all had a different thing to say. And for me, I felt like I was always a storyteller, and it was about the story I wanted to tell. And the stories that attracted me were stories about characters in highly pressured situations where there were, monumental choices to be made.
High stakes, yes.
Right. And then with a background of, political and social questioning about society, about who was in charge, where the power lay, so all of these were sort of deeply psychological, character driven, but had a really epic scope. So, the Scottish play certainly did. I directed Peer Gynt, the Ibsen play, was my 3rd year thesis project. You were gone by then, but it was a wonderful production. And so I was doing this in the theater, and I felt very, very happy and very comfortable there. But when I got out, I either realized I would have to go back to England and become a citizen and work there, because there was really nowhere in America that was doing that at that time. And I got a job right out of Yale. I was an associate artistic director of a theater in St. Louis. And, it was like, can you do another version of the Christmas Carol? Yes. Which, nothing against the Christmas Carol. Great. Fabulous. I took my daughter, but that was not the kind of story that I wanted to tell. So I was kind of floundering for a while. I mean, I did work. I directed Hedda Gabler with Kathy Borowitz, who was John Turturro's wife and wonderful, wonderful actress. But then I found myself at loose ends. And because I also realized that the position of theater in America was very much that you had to fundraise if you were going to do anything that was that ambitious. And so I felt my life will be fundraising and showing up at, Monsanto or whatever to please sponsor a production of X. So, as a director at that time, film and television were very enticing. I also had massive student loan debt from Yale. And I thought it would be nice to be paid for my work. And so I applied to a program called the American Film Institute Directing Workshop for Women.
Yeah, fine.
And I was accepted. And my little project that I did ended up getting a lot of awards. And so for this brief magic moment, Hollywood was actually interested in hiring women. Little did I know.
That was a narrow window of time.
It was a very narrow window, and it shut very quickly. And then it kind of was pried open again a couple of times. But that window was caused by a lawsuit. There were 6 women who sued the studios, and the lawsuit was proceeding up in the courts. And so even though it hadn't been decided, the studios were nervous. And so right as I came out of AFI, everybody was sort of running around going, women, we have to hire women directors. Where do we find them? And there were only 5 of us, so we were actually pretty easy to find. And I was one of them. And Michael Mann, that's where Michael Mann came into it. And I just have to say, you know, because people hear Michael Mann and they think, oh my God, so macho, so testosterone, you know.
Miami Vice,
Michael
crime
is,
story, yeah.
right, men with guns, men with cars, men, you know,
Yes.
women with no clothes. But Michael Mann was doing exactly the kind of stories that I was interested in. And he was doing them very magnificently with great imagery and amazing actors. Like,
And taking huge chances, you know, I think for television at that time, taking big risks too.
Huge risks. I directed a show that was about AIDS in the Catholic Church.
This was network stuff, right? There was
It was on NBC.
No cable, no streaming. This was all network.
This was network stuff. And it was sort of, as Brecht did, it was disguised in this very enticing package of this crime show.
Glossy, yeah.
Sort of great looking guys and banter and, you know, and beautiful images and music, you know, the fabulous music. But really serious stories about corruption in the justice system, about AIDS in the Catholic Church, about the line between, as Michael is interested in, and the line between the quote, good guys and the bad guys being so thin, you know, that it's so easy to cross the line. So he influenced me a great deal, and he was quite a feminist, which people also don't believe, but he has 4 daughters and a wife who's a wonderful artist. And he wanted a woman not just to appease the studios, but because he felt that a woman would bring a different point of view to that show. And when he hired me, he and I just got along brilliantly. And he kind of opened the door and said, you come back anytime, you do as many of these as you want, which was a great, great, great gift. And I learned just a massive amount. His shows ended up getting canceled. I mean, you know, Crime Story was canceled pretty early, 2 years, 2 seasons. And Miami Vice lasted 6 seasons. And you can still go see the classic shows and, you know, on streaming, right? But television suddenly got kind of boring. Like, you know, Michael wasn't doing television. It became very writer-driven.
And then he moved on to film.
And he moved on to film. And he was still he has always been kind of a mentor and now a friend of mine. And in fact, Hannah's War, if we had done a pre-launch party in LA, Michael was going to throw it for me.
Wow.
So
Very
he's a really, really great guy. But then, you know, the world of television was not as exciting. It started to get smaller, and, you know, it was about get the dialogue, get the actors, make sure you have lots of close-ups.
Yes.
And I began to feel like this is not what I signed up for. I mean, I was getting a lot of money, so I was very grateful for that. But I felt that there were stories I wanted to tell that I was not getting to tell. Right. And that became the tension for me of the next probably 10 or 15 years. Shall I say more, or you?
Well, I think that segues us, doesn't it, into you were at AFI. You started to write then, right? And
right.
You then didn't you go? You went back to an MFA program in writing.
I did. Just to
get that jump to start that motor and
it was you know, in the back of my mind, I had always wanted to write a novel because I'm from New York. And if you're from New York, you know, you get up on Sunday and you read the Sunday New York Times book review and you're like, this is what an artist is. If you're an artist, you publish a novel. And so that had always been sort of like the dream. And I went back to a low residency program called Warren Wilson to get an MFA in fiction.
Oh my.
It surprised everybody, but nobody was very happy, least of all my agent. Although I was able to direct while I was in the program because it was low residency. So I was only there for, you would go down for like a month and then you would plan your program.
You go home and you have a mentor, isn't that?
Yes, exactly. And I was mentored by Charles Baxter, who won the National Book Award, nominated for the National Book Award for Feast of Love. Antonia Nelson, who always, has stories in the New York Times, the New Yorker. Joan Silber, who actually won the National Book Award. I mean, I really had amazing mentors. But then I was torn because I had my whole life and my world in Los Angeles, right? And my agent and my manager, and they were all sort of pushing me to go back to directing and to keep directing. And it was my source of income. And then I had this other world of books and fiction and these marvelous teachers, but I just wasn't quite sure how to marry these two. So I would come up with ideas and I would explore them in both places. And a lot of them I ended up writing as films because it turned out that I actually had some ideas that I could pitch and were bought. Just to give you an example, I read an article about Mary J. Blige, the hip hop singer, and it said that her record company had sent her to a vocal coach and an etiquette instructor so that they could bring her out to like galas, to the Grammys, to these public events. And I thought, that sounds kind of odd. Why a vocal coach? And then I read a little more and I found out that it was not for singing, it was for speaking, because she spoke, well, I think the word at that time was ghetto.
Street, yeah.
They wanted to polish her speech up because they had an idea of making her into sort of a Whitney Houston.
So it's Pygmalion, basically.
I mean, it was Pygmalion. It was like, my God. And I developed it and I went into Warner Brothers thinking, well, they'll maybe buy the pitch because it's such a commercial idea. And then they'll hire another writer and they were like, they bought the pitch and then they said, how much do you need to write this?
Oh, great.
And all of a sudden, they were writing me a check. So, and that happened again with another pitch of mine that had Jennifer Lopez interested. So I found out that I had this sort of knack for finding these kind of commercial stories, but again, with this other background, like the Pygmalion story was really about race. Yeah. It was about, remember Ebonics? Yeah. Right? What's the best way to speak? Do we blend in or do we stand out? Do we ask mainstream culture to accept the way we speak? Mm-hmm. And what is music for? Does it represent our neighborhood, our concerns, our politics? Or do we try to fit into a template that the record companies have set for us? So it was always these commercial sort of ideas.
It's interesting you say this because I feel like, with Hannah's War, as I'm reading it, now I've read it twice now too, and it's very cinematic. You know what I mean? It's an engaging novel, wonderful characters, but I don't know if it's the sweep of it, it's the tension, the sort of the tautness of it, the kind of I'm loving the read, and I'm seeing it in a kind of filmic way in my mind's eye. So you've brought these two things completely together in this book.
I think you know, I feel very proud of the book because I feel like it is the realization of that goal that I've had for such a long time. It's the place where I finally was able to actually do what I wanted to do. I still think it can be done in film, you know.
It could be transition into a screenplay will come out of it, or was your original idea for a screenplay, or were you starting, or was it just kind of a melting pot of both
Well, so the original idea, I actually let me tell you how I
go back and talk about how this, just the germ of this, because it's based on a real woman.
Yes.
In your novel, her name is different because there's obviously there's fictionalized aspects to it, but it's based on a real woman.
Yes.
And I love you to talk a little bit about that.
Okay. All right. So I was in the New York Public Library in the microfiche room. I was doing research for something else. And I had this idea that I wanted two characters to meet on the day that World War II ended. So I thought, well, that would probably be the bombing of Hiroshima. That was really the end of the war. So I went scrolling through the microfiche, goes around, and up comes the front page for the reporting of the day we bombed Hiroshima. Huge headline.
In the New York Times.
In the New York Times.
Right.
Bomb dropped, hundreds of thousands killed. Truman vows reign of ruin on Japan. Oh, shocking, horrifying. But then, the way the New York Times sometimes has these sort of historical pieces, because nobody knew about this bomb.
Right. This was all secretive. I mean,
totally.
We look on it now, it seems like it's in every history book, every movie.
Right.
But then it was,
at that time, it was completely secret. It had all been done in such secrecy that they didn't even call Los Alamos. The scientists couldn't call it a bomb when they were in public. They called it the gadget. We're working on the gadget. And they didn't say what the base was. They called it Site Y. So there were all of these ways to keep this thing secret from everybody, including the Americans. So the New York Times had to essentially catch the world up. It's the paper of record, had to catch the world up on this thing that had been developed over 20 years in secret.
Right.
And so I was reading, and maybe it was below the fold. I saw a paragraph with this totally innocuous sentence that said, the key to the Allies getting the bomb was brought to the Allies by a female non-Aryan physicist.
Unbelievable.
And
no name there. No
name. Just, it was like a breadcrumb on the path for Hansel and Gretel. And I just devoured that breadcrumb and said, I want more. Because I just knew from just reading that, I thought, okay, first of all, a woman who is responsible for the most important scientific discovery of the 20th century. Why don't I know her? Why isn't her picture in every single science textbook?
If they're going to go to the trouble of saying a woman, a non-Aryan woman, if they're going to be so specific about that, why not just give the name? And this, as I understand, and I've done a little research on her, she was at the time, certainly in the scientific community, she was well known and highly regarded. So it's not like she was someone that was, she was in the world. She was known to some. So it just baffles me as to why they would not, were they trying to protect her, do you think? Or
It could have been a number of things.
just the way women were regarded then?
It was partly the way women were regarded. If you've noticed now, the New York Times has been doing these obituaries of women who they should have done obituaries on like 20, 30 years ago, because the New York Times is it's run by men. So that might have been part of it. Yes. It is also true that she worked with a partner, and her partner was German, and her partner, Otto Hahn, continued to work for Germany. So to some extent...
You mean after the war?
During the war.
During
the war and after the war. So he was still working with Germany when that headline came out. In fact, he was in custody at that point. The Americans had him and all the German scientists in custody. But he won the Nobel Prize for the discovery, which she deserved. And I'll tell you exactly why. When you go back and you look at the research, when they'd been working together for a while, and everybody knew in the science community that splitting the atom was kind of the next big thing. It was the next big discovery on the horizon. And so they had been working on this, and they'd published some papers together that her name was left off of because she was Jewish. And if they had published the papers with her name, they would have been discredited as what was called Jewish physics. Anything to do with Einstein, anything to do with Jewish scientists under Hitler was, vilified. So his name was on, her name was not. She was Austrian and she was Jewish, but she didn't particularly consider herself Jewish in the sense that at that point, Austrian Jews in particular felt like they had been completely assimilated. So their status in society wasn't about being Jewish as much as it was being professional. Her father had been a doctor. And what was going on in Germany was these Nuremberg laws were written, and I think there's some very, very contemporary parallels here, but the Nuremberg laws were written so that they just chipped away at rights in the tiniest, tiniest, tiniest ways.
Slowly, incrementally.
So incrementally, like, you could buy milk at only these stores. Then you could buy milk at only these stores on only Monday, Wednesday, and Friday if you were Jewish. Then you could only buy milk on these stores on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday between 12 and 2. Then between 12 and 1. So, so people adapted to these changes, and they didn't realize the scope of what was going on because it was just a small thing.
And everyone, I'm sure, must have felt like the last one. Okay.
Yeah, okay, this will be it.
Then it's over. Yeah.
We'll, and look, we've been through the same thing. I haven't heard anybody talking about, the families and the kids we've got in cages down at the border.
Right.
Because that was just horrifying a year ago. But now we're talking about COVID-19 because there's been so much that's happened that superseded that. So also, this is Dr. Lisa Meitner is the woman that was the inspiration for the character of Hannah and was the mysterious female non-Aryan scientist referred to. She also had these colleagues of hers that were saying, "You're untouchable. We'll protect you. you're working at the highest level at this research institute. The work we're doing is so important that, you know, the Nazis will never touch you. Right. And what happened was Austria was annexed. A fellow scientist turned her in, actually called and said where she was, and she had 6 hours to leave the country or get dragged off to the camps.
So as long as before Austria was annexed, then she had the protection of being Austrian.
Correct.
Even though there might have been a hint or something that she was Jewish, she was protected by that.
She was an Austrian citizen, not a German Jew.
Right. But then once it was annexed, then all bets were off for her.
She became a German Jew, just any old German Jew, like all the others, to be disposed of. And so she had 6 hours to leave, and she fled with help, of course, but, you know, 6 hours.
Help from within the community of the scientists that she worked with?
Yeah, one or two, but not nearly the kind of help she was expecting. I mean, they said, look, we won't even let them touch you, you know. And in the end, I think one of them helped her get papers with a new name, and she traveled to Holland, and she was going to go to, because at that point, a lot of those countries were still controlled by Germany. And so she ended up going to Sweden. And in Sweden, at that time, she was okay.
Okay.
But Otto Hahn, her partner, could not work without her. So he arranged to meet with her in secret in Copenhagen.
Amazing.
And they devised experiments to do that he would go back to Germany and do, because she didn't have access to a lab or any of the equipment or things that he had at the Kaiser Wilhelm. And so he would go back and do the experiments in Germany, and then he would send the results on postcards via courier to her in Sweden. And so he would do these experiments, but he didn't really know what they meant. Mm-hmm. He was sending them to her.
He was kind of working for her.
He was kind of the chemist, but she was the big picture physicist and the mathematician who could figure out what these equations, you know, what the chemical results really, what had happened to produce those particular chemical results.
And so did he travel to Copenhagen under the, you know, just some other pretenses? He had some other, because he had to have some kind of excuse or reason to go, to keep returning there. He must have.
I don't know that he returned. I think he just went once, and I think he kind of devised these experiments in that one session. But, you know, the Germans were free to go elsewhere at that time. He wasn't Jewish. He could go any place in the world.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But she was the one who was restricted. So she got a postcard that was very, very puzzling. And Otto Hahn had no clue. Like, he just didn't understand. He was completely baffled by the results of this particular test. And she was cross-country skiing with her nephew, just like a movie, right? In the Swedish woods. And all of a sudden she stopped, and she took her ski pole and she started doing equations in the snow.
Fantastic.
And she said, I know what happened. The only way he could have possibly gotten these results was if the atom was split, because there were basically too many neutrons to account for. And so she was the one who said, this is nuclear fission. We've split the atom. Otto Hahn went ahead and published that without her name. But when you read the article, it's really clear that he doesn't really understand he can't really explain what he's talking about. And in the next issue, Lisa Meitner writes a letter to the editor in which she explains what happened.
Fantastic.
So it's so, I mean, once I was burrowing into this research, I thought this is more and more fascinating. I mean, who could have even imagined that they'd be on the verge of splitting the atom right as Hitler came to power, right as she had to leave. And then after the war, Otto Hahn was awarded the Nobel Prize. And I read in her diary, she was in the audience, and she writes, "I'm so hurt. I can't believe that he didn't even mention my name."
Oh.
And it was so heartbreaking to me. But also, I have to say, it was so familiar. As a woman director, I'm not saying only I have had that experience, but every woman I know has sat in a meeting, had a great idea, raised their hand, said their idea, and people don't really, oh, thank you very much. And then a guy raises his hand or doesn't, just interrupts, 10 minutes later, and it becomes his idea. And that is what happened with Otto Hahn. The Nobel Prize Committee, decided to award this to him. There were many scientists who said, she deserves the prize, but they gave it to him without her name. And now their position is that they don't give out Nobels posthumously. So they will never correct the record. It happened to Rosalind Franklin too, with the structure of DNA. So, this is not the only time this has happened, but for such an extraordinary discovery and a woman who was such a genius and had fought so hard to get where she was, I felt like I have to tell the story. I have to shine a light on this woman because she's been erased from history and she deserves to be put back in her rightful place.
So you've created this sort of fictionalized version of Lisa Meitner, and then there's the other kind of one of the main components in your novel is also based on a real figure, a real historical figure, Heisenberg.
Yes.
Am I getting that right?
Yes. Yes.
So you kind of transition into the Heisenberg?
Absolutely. So, the Lisa Meitner part, and the reason I say inspired by her rather than based on her, is because there are lovely biographies of her, once you look. And after that particular period, her story is not really novel worthy. Mm-hmm. She was an extraordinary woman, but once she went to Sweden, she kind of settled in and continued to do her work. And at that point, I had gotten fascinated by this race between the Allies and the Germans to develop the bomb. It's obviously that, that's a ticking clock in any story, right? You have
neither side really understands or knows where the other side is.
Correct, because everything is in secret, because it's wartime, so nobody knows what's going on unless there's a spy somewhere. And so the atomic bomb project really came out of the fact that Einstein and a couple of other scientists were concerned that the Germans, because they had actually split the atom, that was done in Kaiser Wilhelm, because Otto Hahn and Werner Heisenberg and some other really wonderful scientists remained in Germany, they were concerned that they were one step away from handing this atomic bomb over to Hitler, which we certainly know that Hitler would probably have had no compunction about blowing England into smithereens or the world. So that was the trigger for America to get into doing the Manhattan Project. And it wouldn't have happened otherwise. So, but that terror, and because most of the scientists who came to Los Alamos to work with J. Robert Oppenheimer on this project were Jewish or were Eastern European. And so they had a very personal reason for being there. They felt like they had families back home. They may have had families that died in the concentration camps. They didn't know. Yeah. But the idea of Hitler getting the atomic bomb was just evil. And so they quite frantically came together under the leadership, dual leadership of Oppenheimer on the scientific side and General Leslie Groves on the military side to develop this bomb. And they were in a race with the Germans, and I discovered that there was a tiny group that reported directly to General Groves. It was scientists, interrogators, and military people that were going in on the front lines with the troops as they moved into Europe. And they were looking for anything that might indicate how close the Germans were to the bomb, any materials they could confiscate, like enriched uranium or plutonium, that they could confiscate and bring to America. But most importantly, they were looking for those scientists because they, at that point in the war, they did not want those scientists to go over to Russia.
Right.
So the fascinating thing to me, and the thing that I found perplexing, I think a lot of people do, is that when they did find the scientists, not only were they not a minute away from having the bomb, they were like light years away from having the bomb. They weren't even working on the bomb. They had an atomic pile that was the most rudimentary. They were hiding out in a little church in a little town in the Black Forest, kind of dirty, and they'd been sleeping on cots in this big tunnel that had been dug. And Werner Heisenberg, who was the head of the nuclear research program, so he was the guy that everybody thought was the most brilliant of all, and the one they were afraid of, because they thought if they have him, and he refused to come to Los Alamos, although they tried to get him there, and he wouldn't. He said, I'm loyal to my country. And so he stayed.
So we tried to recruit him, but...
Oh, they tried many times. And nobody knows why he didn't come to America. But one of the things that I found fascinating in this book by Thomas Powers called Heisenberg's War, when they ended up finding the scientists, and I do actually use this in the book because it was such a fascinating thing. They found all the scientists except Heisenberg cowering in these tunnels below this church. But Heisenberg wasn't there. And they were worried that perhaps he had gone to the Russians. But no, Heisenberg was in his family's summer house in a nearby town. And when they went to arrest him, as they were walking through these beautiful woods, with this summer house, it was a little bit run down, and all of a sudden they hear the notes of a piano. And they walk in with their guns drawn, and Heisenberg is sitting there playing the piano. And he turns around and holds his hands up. And that story made me think, this guy was not a Hitler loyalist. This guy was not fighting arrest. He was playing music. And by then I had read enough to see that there were several places in which he had given some speeches, and there are transcripts of them, particularly one to Albert Speer, who was supposed to tell Hitler how they were doing on this atomic bomb. And he had given a kind of a speech in which he said, yes, yes, we can absolutely get the bomb, but here's how big it will have to be. And of course, it's not big enough to go in any of the planes we currently have. So we'll have to redesign all of the planes.
I mean, it's too big to go into the planes we have.
Yeah, too big, sorry, way too big so we'll have to redesign all of the planes. And of course, Speer was like, well, who are you kidding? We don't have that kind of money. We can't do that. We're fighting the Russians. We're losing, go away, stop. It's not happening. And then what they did was they arrested this. They didn't know what to do with these scientists because technically they weren't really war combatants, so they couldn't be prisoners of war. But they also couldn't let them go because they didn't want them to go over to the Russians. They wanted to keep them. So they took them to a manor house in England, and they recorded their conversations from 24 hours.
Kind of essentially like house arrest, sort of.
Yes, like house arrest in a very beautiful manor house with lovely breakfasts, and they were treated well. And they were all together, they weren't separated. So, but meanwhile, the United States was listening to all of their conversations over breakfast, over drinks. And at one point, I think Heisenberg says something like, you don't suppose they're listening in on our conversations, do you? And Otto Hahn, who was been Lisa Meitner's partner, says, no, that's Gestapo tactics. The Americans are too stupid. Meanwhile, the Americans are recording every word. And on the day, the same headline that I read about dropping the bomb on Hiroshima was brought to them with their breakfast. And they're reading it, and they all have slightly different reactions. Otto Hahn is horrified. He's ready to commit suicide because they didn't get it. And he says to Heisenberg, you must feel like I feel like such an idiot. You must feel like such an idiot. And Heisenberg doesn't say anything. And this is on a transcript. And for a long time, you don't hear anything. He's actually scribbling on a napkin, which is something scientists do all the time. And about 5 minutes later, he says, I know how the Americans did it. And he proceeds to tell the other Germans exactly how the Americans developed the bomb.
Amazing.
And I thought, I know this guy was a Nobel Prize winner. I know he was a genius. But how could he have figured out in 5 minutes how the Americans did this and not have known something more than what he pretended he knew? That was my sense of it. And since this is fiction, and my rule for fiction is that it has to be possible. It
has to be plausible, right?
It has to be plausible. We will never know. Heisenberg was very mysterious. He went to his grave. He never really told anybody what he had been up to during the war. Although he did give some hints, but a lot of people thought, oh, well, after the fact, he's trying to look like a good guy, so sure, he's now hinting that maybe he, wasn't so into working for Hitler. But anyway, nobody will know. And it's a huge mystery when you think about it, why the Germans with all of that head start didn't get the bomb. And I thought, I think between these two pieces of history and everything I now know about Los Alamos, there is an incredible story here.
Yes.
And so I took those two pieces as my sort of, let's just say, the beginning and the end of the story.
Yeah, we don't want to. We have a
We
spoiler
don't want to give it,
problem here.
no, don't give it away. But
No.
There was enough there that I knew I had an amazing story, and
That's the thing that strikes me so beautifully about this is that, we're talking about, the Germans working on their side, we're working, the Manhattan Project, everything is very secretive. Not, other than maybe the president, no one really in the country is aware, not even other branches of the military, not, other areas of scientific pursuit. And so what's sort of brilliantly kind of drawn here by in the book is that, there are the larger secrets, of course, but then there's all of these individual interesting characters who are all holding their own personal secrets. There's all kinds of the number and the levels of layers of all of these characters. Is someone, what is the truth? Are they dissembling? Are they withholding? Are they completely not who they appear to be? What is this relationship? Are they even keeping secrets? People who appear close, are they keeping secrets from each other? People who are family, people who are best friends. That it's just this sort of stew of enigma and secrecy, and that's just what makes it so kind of compelling. And you just have to take a deep dive into the story. It's beautiful.
Thank you. I don't even know. Of course, I knew these people were keeping secrets, but it's almost as if once I figured out sort of the big thing they were hiding, I was so influenced by Los Alamos itself, because in Los Alamos, everyone was paranoid. The military was in control, but the military was nothing unless the scientists were working at full speed.
That's right. And they had to be careful. They were trying to drive it, but they had to be careful not to alienate, certain components and people that they desperately needed. And there was that whole sort of overlay of them being worried about the commies,
yes,
the communist sympathizers in that group.
Yes.
Right? Wasn't Oppenheimer's brother, as I think you mentioned.
Oppenheimer's brother was a communist. Oppenheimer had a mistress who was a card-carrying communist. Oppenheimer had been to many meetings. Hoover was appalled when he found out that General Groves was making Oppenheimer the head of this mission. The man's a communist. He's an enemy of America. What are you doing? And Groves said,
he's the guy.
So I need him.
Yeah.
He is the only man who can pull this together.
There isn't the benches. There is no bench. If you don't,
there's no bench, and there are certainly no, Republicans who are great scientists. So there were all of these uneasy tensions and people concealing things from other people. And there was a great thing I read where Hans Bethe, who was a great mathematician, said to Oppenheimer, because Oppenheimer was trying to keep this thing going. And so he had been told by Groves that they all needed to be military, that they all were going to be given, military uniforms and ranks and titles. And he had been fitted for a uniform, I think. And so he went to Hans Bethe and said, yes, well, you guys are going to have to wear uniforms. And Hans Bethe just looked at him with his accent and said, I will discover the atomic bomb as a professor. I will not discover the atomic bomb as a colonel. and that was it. No uniforms, no titles. So
there was all of that. I mean, and I think that it really comes through in the book too. they're conflicted, obviously, that the scientists they know what they're doing. They know what they have to do. They know that they're in a race with the Germans, but, and not knowing how far along they are, but they're also worried that if we succeed in this, what are we really doing? What is the long game here? Is it gonna, is it, is a demonstration going to be enough? Or is it going to have to actually be, implemented, and our lives going to be shattered, and is the world going to change forever? And so they're kind of working at cross purposes, and
I think
they're not all on the same page.
They were even working at cross purposes with their own morality.
Sure. I mean, they're conflicted, yes, within them.
They are conflicted about what they're being asked to do and why they're being asked to do it by the military, but they were also meeting, and they were passing around petitions, yes, saying this cannot be used on human beings. We want to, say that this is for demonstration only.
Right.
And they kept feeling, and that was my sort of trigger for the beginning of the book, because there was this sort of sedition in the ranks of, yes, these people sort of going, we're really not on board with what you guys are thinking. We want to control how this is going to work, which of course the military didn't like that at all. Yes. And so, so they were meeting, they were passing around petitions, and so the level of, of paranoia just was jacked up and up. The scientists couldn't leave the compound.
Not only could they not leave, but, and what I think kind of comes sort of through beautifully too in the book too, is that, there's all the political and sort of ethical issues at play, but there's also this sort of, these scientists they really, part of their nature as professional scientists, I mean, it's like a compulsion. They can't stop themselves. They can't not figure out a problem. They That's just right. have to. Every fiber, every cell in their being is wants to get to the end of the equation.
The truth. What is the nature of matter? What happens?
They can't stop themselves.
They can't stop themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, I have to read here because I was looking, researching Lee's, do you say Lee's or Lisa?
Lisa, yeah.
Lisa Meitner. And I started to look at her because you can Google her and it's just fascinating. And I want to read now about her, but amazing. She has all these quotes. She sort of there's this one that struck me. I'm going to just read it quickly. Science makes people reach selflessly for truth and objectivity. It teaches people to accept reality with wonder and admiration, not to mention the deep awe and joy that the natural order of things brings to the true scientist. I mean, these are words that are ringing and resonating right now today when we're in this whole political, shitstorm of science being disrespected on the one hand and not trusted, and here we are. We're right back at the crux of this issue.
Yes, and I was reading about Anthony Fauci, and he, from the time he was really young, he also has that obsession. He said, I knew that I wanted to specialize in studying diseases that nobody understood, but that if I could understand them, I could save people's lives. I mean, he was like 12. and he has spent his entire life doing that and fighting all of the political battles.
Yeah, and he's worked for
he's worked for 6 different administrations.
Both conservative.
And mostly successfully.
Yeah.
But, I mean, he had to fight about HIV/AIDS with the Reagan administration. They weren't, and well, look at the position he's in now, but God bless him. I see Lisa Meitner in that way, because the quote you read is gorgeous. Yes. But I opened the book with a quote from her too, which is, those blessed with a brilliant mind and a gift for science have a higher duty that comes before discovery, a duty to humanity. Science can be used for good or evil, so it's incumbent upon scientists to ensure that their work makes the world a better place.
That says it all.
So, yes, she turned out to be a heroine, more of a heroine even than I knew when I started on that path. Yeah. And I think that even though I deviated from her story, I would like to think that I honored her spirit in the way I portrayed her in the character of Hannah Weiss.
And I know we've talked a lot about the physicists and the issues of the bomb but I just want to assure people, because I really encourage everybody to read this book. You know, it doesn't really you shouldn't be sort of, you know, intimidated by the science of it. The science is not sort of the main focus of the book. I mean, it's touched on and it's described in a very accessible way. We don't get, you know, Jan does not get deeply into the weeds, and you don't have to kind of feel like you're going back to, you know, senior year physics. But it's fascinating and interesting and accessible. But it's also, the book is more than that too. It's got romance. It's a cat and mouse game. It's about, you know, the racial issue. It's about you know, and it also, we're transitioning in this period. Very important, I believe, is we're transitioning because we're out of the you know, FDR is driving this bus until then he passes away, and
he
so
actually dies in the book.
Dies in the story. So now we're moving into a whole different administration, which is there's a whole nother novel there. But
yes, that's my next one.
Well, there's so many kind of possible sequels that I want to see to the Head of War. The niece's story,
going back to Brecht for a minute.
Yes.
He believed that all of this had to be really fun. Yeah. I mean, all of his political ideas were very important, but basically he was about, bread and circuses. You need to get people into the theater because they wanted to be there. And I feel like, I love all of this stuff, the science and the politics, but what I love is the espionage thriller.
Yeah.
Who's telling the truth? Is there a spy? Isn't there a spy?
Is she a femme fatale?
Why is she spying?
Yeah.
Oh, she thinks that the guy who's interrogating her is withholding something. And so what does she do about that? So, it is a cat and mouse game. It is, what I hope is that it's really a thriller that you kind of can't stop turning the pages because you need to know what happens.
And ultimately, in some ways, it's also sort of a battle of the sexes. I mean, it's just, it's a woman just kind of like, this sort of rising and having to navigate her way in the the men's world, the boys' club, and being as formidable, strong, really, really brilliant, intellectually kind of superior. That whole part of it is really engaging too.
Thank you. Well, there's a lot of questions now about whether women have different points of view, whether when we see movies or we read books that are written by women, whether women bring a different gaze. Is there a female gaze? Is there a female experience that's different from men? And, I'm not sure I want to wade into that whole big topic, but, from that quote that I read of Meitner's, it's very clear that she considers herself a humanist before she's a scientist, or that they're equal.
Yes, yes.
And my sense of the men, and there was a wonderful documentary that really talked to all of the people in Oppenheimer's inner circle. It was called The Day After Trinity. And one scientist says, everything I know about myself and my own system of morality tells me that when I knew the Germans didn't have the bomb, I should have turned on my heel and walked out of there.
Yeah.
But I couldn't. Just as you said, I had to stay to see whether it worked.
Yeah.
And I think that may be a difference, not necessarily between all men and all women, but I think that Lisa Meitner herself, and I have borrowed that to give Hannah, does have a bigger sense of some of the resonance of this. Yes. And what her obligation is, having discovered it.
Just being a scientist.
Yes, yeah. Yes. That she maybe has a larger obligation to, that Jewish saying, tikkun olam, which is to repair the world, to heal the world. I think she feels that obligation, that she brought this, or she was part of the team that brought this possibility into being. And then she does have a responsibility to determine how it's used or not used.
Exactly. Fascinating.
If you have questions, I can tell you that I have questions after this conversation because it was so fascinating. And I just wish I could talk with you forever about this. But if people listening have questions, please post them. And I will be looking at the commentary on Facebook, and I will endeavor to answer any question that's asked.
And if you, I highly recommend you get this book.